Adelante.
Let's proceed.
Adelante.
Bueno, muy buenos días.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is an honor for me to give you the warmest welcome to our second virtual coffee time of this cycle of green and violet coffee times as part of our leadership of Mr. Jose Vicente Troya Rodriguez. So from UNDP and within the framework of these Green and Violet Coffee Times, we recognize and celebrate the Latin American women that are powerful and that work in the conservation of natural resources and resilience to climate change. Today, we have the great honor of having Dr. Brigitte Baptiste, because this discussion that will be led by Don Jose Vicente Troya will show us women and the great diversity. In UNDP, we celebrate all the women, we celebrate all of us, and precisely within diversity is where we find the greatest human vibration. So we want you to enjoy this very much, that you can be able to deepen throughout these reflections that we bring to you today in this Green and Violet Coffee Time. This strategy is only possible thanks to the relationship between the gender of the UNDP team and the Costa Rican office of UNDP. And for that, I would like to recognize the people that make it possible for us to have these great encounters of Green and Violet coffee times in Latin America. To Guillermina Martin, our team leader, Andrea Quesada Aguilar, Patricia Oviedo, Carolina Cornejo, Diana Garro, Ana Maria Rodriguez, Tatiana Lopez, and Mildred Corrales. I would like to also let you know that you can give us and share your comments or questions in the lower portion of the Zoom for questions and answers, and we will be responding to your comments and questions. Also, we would like to let you know that we will have live broadcasts in our Facebook pages and also in the UNDP Costa Rica office. So let's start enjoying this. And thank you so much, Dr. Brigitte Baptiste, for joining us today and having and giving us the honor of listening to your words. Thank you very much, Rafaela. Good morning to everyone. It's truly a pleasure for us that you can join us via Zoom and also in this live broadcast. My name is Jose Vicente Troya Rodriguez, and it is an honor for me as UNDP Gender and Environment Champion for Latin America and the Caribbean, and as the UNDP resident representative in Costa Rica, to give you the warmest welcome to this second Green and Violet virtual coffee time. The voices of Latin American women that protect and transform our environment. Today, we have a new guest of honor, a powerful woman, a leader and revolutionary in our region, Dr. Brigitte Baptiste, rector of the EAN University in Bogota, Colombia. May you be very welcome, dear Brigitte. Jose, very good morning, and thank you so much for those kind words, and also Rafaela for that warm welcome. And of course, a great hello to the UNDP team, not only those working for gender and environment topics, but also for the great work that you all do. Great, thank you. So we thank you very much again for giving us the honor of having you join us today, dear Brigitte. We recognize that in Latin America and the Caribbean, there are unique women who are agents of change and who lead pioneering efforts in various environmental issues and promote gender equality and women's empowerment across diverse ecosystems. For this reason, UNDP created the space of Green and Violet virtual coffee times to highlight your voices, to listen to your vast experiences, and to identify priority actions in the region to promote a social and environmental transformation that recognizes the contributions of women in their diversity and that at the same time promotes their autonomy. I venture an analogy between what happens in nature and what can and should happen in our society. The resilience of our Mother Nature is vitally linked to its degree of diversity. The greater the diversity, the greater the resilience, and therefore the greater the capacity to face and regenerate after traumatic events. The same is true for people. The more diverse a society and the more opportunities it has to express its diversity, the greater its resilience to face the global ills that afflict humanity and the planet, such as the climate crisis. At UNDP, we are convinced that we can advance sustainable development without leaving anyone behind. It is the task of each and every one of us to safeguard, nurture, and empower all of this diversity. Once again, Brigitte, for this discussion, we would like to ask you to please tell us, and we will start with this question. What are the biggest challenges that Colombia is facing at the time being in terms of gender inclusion and environmental degradation? Please go ahead. Well, I think that there are challenges that we share along with many Latin American countries, even with Africa and with countries in Africa and Asia, that shows the great complexity, social and ecological complexity that we enjoy. Sometimes we have a hard time understanding and managing it. Those challenges would be associated to the capacity of being able to identify and address how environmental transformations have differential effects or impacts with the gender roles, the life forms defined by the gender conditions, and therefore also the life conditions where those transformations occur. So first, there's this awareness that every environmental transformation has impacts on different groups of society. One could use the typology that the biological biodiversity agreement does in trying to understand where women result more vulnerable towards those territorial transformations, social and ecological transformations as well. If you think of the access to resources, for example, clearly depending on the environment where women are, those challenges are going to be different. And it is only about the rural environment versus the urban environment in Latin America, for example, and in Colombia specifically, where the displacements of rurality into the city are massive. And we stop, for example, in our country, about 80% of our people are living in cities. Of course, then there is a very different condition between the rural women and urban women. And also, we have some important migration issues, international migrations. Colombia is going through, the visit of big immigration groups of Haiti and Venezuela, and also, different conditions that women face when there's a rupture of family structures, for example, and very dramatic effects or very different effects on the women that stay behind or on their quality of life and their well-being. So there, one could state in more detail that for every transformation process in a territory, what would be the typology of those effects? And I would say that having four large think motors in global platforms, one could think, for example, the expansion of the agricultural frontier or the expansion processes might have on women and men. In Colombia, for example, deforestation continues to be a very serious problem. Erosion, the loss of wildlife areas, and these have differential effects. Generally, it is men who are ahead of the colonization act or the opening of mines in places where gold is found. And then women came in and normally in very, bad conditions, both in health and work conditions. So the basic transformation normally is led or continues to be led by men. And then the direct or indirect support by women and children with very important um, effects. And even in illegal mining, women tend to become slaves of the places in gold extraction, for example, also for drug trafficking as well. In the expansion of ecological transformation is financed by illegal capital. And of course, machismo marks a very drastic differentiation in gender roles. And it even, you know, it starts attracting levels of violence that are very high on women and girls and boys. When you think of the overexploitation of resources, not only transformation, but the overexploitation of fishing resources, for example, when there's not enough food or not enough water, then of course, then there is a very specific characterization of who are the people that are impacted in the first place. So men in the first place, or girls, and in many rural communities, they suffer malnutrition and they are, you know, put in, they are relegated to suffering scarcity, for example, fishing or any other type of resource. And this is very dramatic, especially in some indigenous and rural communities in the country, but also in the urban communities. Contamination, which is a third transformation factor of ecosystems, is very dramatic. Contamination has differential effects on physiology, on the reproductive health and the life of women. And very often, the health services are not equipped to address in the right way those things that have to do, for example, with air and water contamination, pollution, or food pollution by agrochemicals, for example. So there are very big differentials in that, say, in terms of health for women and communities. And maybe lastly, and very interesting, the fourth factor that we recognize as a transformer of ecosystems are ecological invasions. So plants and animals that come in to a territory. And I'm going to give an example, which seems a little bit trivial, but for example, uh, some dogs, you know, feral dogs, abandoning dogs in peripheral areas represent a very large danger for greater for women and girls than men who are more trained to facing the risk of facing, a group of feral dogs. But we can extend this to biological or microbial or fungus and vectors, so invading fauna and the diseases of cultivated plants, for example, when we talk about um, food safety and security also can create a very big differential. And all this is very much related or has a lot to do with a very important cultural aspect in our countries, which is the matrilocality, in the measure that men have more mobility throughout territories, they have more cultural independence and economic independence, and that makes women become more vulnerable to almost all these transformation factors. Women are not able to easily escape these ecological, problems in territories. Thank you very much, Brigitte. And that makes me think on the main uh, transforming agents, that are harmful, which in general could be because of all these characteristics, but also possibly there might be cases in which the transformation of forests of the Amazon, for example, that has occurred with the millenary act, probably that transformation and that positive diversification is also in this case in the hands of women. So I think that those are also millenary stories where women, where indigenous women and their relationship with nature have been rich in giving shape to nature from many, you know, thousands of years before. And I think that the contribution coming from women, and maybe from there, going back more into the present, I have a question, which is the following. How is the political situation of Colombia influencing now and the world of the human rights of women in diversity and also in the conservation of biodiversity? Well, Jose, there are two sides of a coin, and I'm going to start with the positive side. I think that in general, women are participating in a much more active way and a much more conscious and aware way in the defense of biological resources and in the defense of the seeds and food resources and the quality of water and in general in a territory very adequate of the awareness of the place and the importance of preserving the health of ecosystems. There is a very integrating concept there. And what we have seen is that urban women, especially, have been able to bring in that awareness of the dependency of rural ecosystems and agricultural systems into the policies that are built, and especially in cities. And what we have found are the eco-feminist movements, urban eco-feminist movements that are even, belligerent, in the good sense of the word, and, raising awareness on the disaster that we humans are causing in the world and the risk that those transformations represent for all people. So we are seeing feminism on the streets in social organisms and institutions and NGOs, and also within institutions, claiming more awareness and awareness of the world, throughout different areas and different pillars. And there are different, there's, differentiated leaderships and also capacities, but I think that the important thing is also some feminine leadership when facing this climatic disaster. The dark side of the coin is the increase of gender violence against rural leaders, female leaders, women that have defended the territory, that, whether they are opposed, pacifically or peacefully to the development of infrastructure or mining or agro-industrial projects. Women that because of their location in a territory have taken on that defense of the life conditions, the local life conditions, because they have been able to see that the promise of development has not reached them and that men did not adequately or appropriately defend the interests of the community, or they became corrupted, or they migrated, or they are not, there present to take on those tasks. And here the voice of women environmental leaders, they are trying to silence them many times. There's a lot of, murders and threats, and many happen because of the gender vulnerability condition. Threats because on the feminine side, threats to, violations or rape and the condition of children. And, that is also generating displacements or the, resignation of spaces. So society becomes more violent. So those are the two sides of the situation that I think that are very important to be considered. Thank you very much, Brigitte. Now we would like to ask you to tell us in what way sustainable use of resources and green enterprises promote environmental conservation. Considering that one of your focuses as director of EN is to promote the issue of sustainable ventures, could you please comment on a particular case study that has inspired you to focus on this issue? How can we make these sustainable ventures represent an opportunity for women in all their diversity? Well, the truth is that for many years, I think that it's going to be, already 2 or 3 decades of studies that show that female ventures are more successful, are more persistent. They reverse or they give back more resources to the domestic economy or home economy. Because looking at it between the metro locality and the defense of the territory and domestic economy, there is a more holistic awareness of the protection of the well-being. And this makes it that when we support ideas and small business ventures, they normally tend to be more successful than those done by other people. And there is a very, clear aspect in nutritional innovation in the defense of the use of foods, medicinal plants and foods that are local, or the recovery of ancestral knowledge. Of course, all of this is very rural and it is hard to understand it within the rural context. But in the rural context, this relationship with um, food traditions, for example, has become a, a, a food innovation space. So, for example, what ancestral traditions can become food or products for nutrition at schools, or to strengthen the prevention of diseases, for example. We have very large programs for the training of women associated to, for example, public institutions. So, for example, this has launched, also our mayor in the city has launched some programs, and this has become a successful recipe for investments in entrepreneurship. And maybe I don't have a specific case study to highlight, but it's more an entrepreneurial movement of business women. So in the economy of care and well-being, in the economy of nutrition, which is accessing many different services that the society needed and that were not clearly associated with, green elements, or opportunities in bioeconomy. For example, in recycling, we have a lot of work done by women that are starting to structure new business ventures, not only with the separation of waste, but with the creative use of waste in the production of new products, etc. So I think that there we have a very, hopeful element and very positive element that is happening in different levels of work, because we're talking about women in small and medium enterprises, and we're starting to see that break of that, glass ceiling with green business agendas of production that definitely come from a reflection on the participation of women in economy. Thank you very much, Brigitte. It is impressive to see how human diversity is of such a nature that produces different things, different epiphanies. This information normally is not at the reach of knowledge or the awareness of our people. And it is precisely It is the condition of diversity that can produce those multiple epiphanies, these, revelations, and these, clear proof and evidence that highlight the importance of this transforming role that women can have in the management of ecosystems. Now, we would like to ask you, what do you see as the positive impacts of the ecosystem restoration in conflict affected communities? How can green recovery become a tool to improve the access to resources, to promote peace building, and promote the empowerment of women in all their diversity? And in conclusion, to become a vehicle so that humanity can declare peace in nature. So, in great measure, because we do recognize that there is a synergy between the restoration and ecological recovery and the conditions of the health of territories, the well-being and governance, that continuum that exists between all those aspects makes it possible for the women that remain in the territory and become linked, or related through business uh, ventures and restoration. They produce a lot of benefits in many different dimensions. For example, in the recovery of seeds, most of the rural development programs nowadays depend on recovering and maintaining traditions of production based on the diversity of plants, of daily consumption. For example, beans. So, if genetic erosion that comes from the difficulties of exchanging seeds and maintaining seeds, alive because of armed conflicts or because of reasons of destruction of the territory, then of course, then we will be able to see the destruction of nutrition and community resilience or resilience of communities. But when women are in charge of production of food in rural areas, then clearly to support women is the best alternative, both ecologically as well as economically. And I think that that's where we can see that the SDGs can give us a very positive perspective. In other words, we can solve more than one problem at once, and that is a positive message. Soil restoration or urban soil restoration is happening in the hands of cooperatives led by women that are talking about, you know, urban orchards or gardens, sometimes very simple, in abandoned fields or land, where the role of women, more than being the producers of food, would be to convene the reorganization of communities in order to create social relationships, to protect one another. So there's a clear relationship between peace building and resilience building, as well as Jose mentioned, and the equal and fair participation of women in society. It is an entire ecological and social regeneration process. Everything you say is so interesting, and it puts you immediately to reflect on the fact, for example, if this is the way or the road through which, with all that transforming power, we can also be building and developing other more masculinities, much positive, more positive, less toxic, and hand in hand with nature. So how nature has that healing power to transform masculinities as well. And I think that that's a line of work that would be worth to explore, and maybe it's being done. And if you allow me, Jose, I would like to comment on that. I think it is happening. It is unavoidable. I think that as there is a reconsideration, a redefinition of the construction of what is feminine and its participation in society with a healing, constructive, regenerative um, perspective that not only is manifested in the body of women, but in the social body. All the people that take on those sorts of tasks, we could say that they are feminizing culture and they are embracing a perspective of which that women or men are not foreign to. And that's something, the toxic part, we will need to work on that deeply in sociology, to delinquency. And this is more like, the societies normally, you know, have to pick out men, but it's not that all the orca or killer whale societies kick out the boys, but it's that masculinity becomes a disruptive factor that becomes too strong, and just like the killer whale societies that generates delinquency. So when you start looking at mafias in drug trafficking or in human trafficking or in the traffic of resources, there's always masculine toxic acts. So I don't want to be very deterministic, but a machismo or masculinity to the extreme is you know, can be put on this or pushed to the side, but with the potential of becoming even more dangerous for society as a whole. Wow, that's very interesting. This topic is fascinating. And sometimes you just start wondering and thinking, so when you start transitioning towards the feminine, it's like ethics start evolving. In other words, human beings, we can be an evolutionary object of our genetics. I think this is very interesting because I think that not everything is already written about our destination or our destiny, I think, or our fate. Yes, and that perspective, evolutionary uh, you know, role of ethics, is evolving a lot because as live beings and we depend on our reflection capacity and evolution, we can actually make, we can, transform our society. And we're not talking about biological evolution, but we're talking about the evolution of behavior that I believe is what we are, defending now in these times of climate change. Our bioethics are the ones that will be leading us in the way to overcome climate crisis and environmental crisis. So from cooperation, we have another question that we have a lot of curiosity on. So considering your extensive background in conservation and development issues, what are three areas or issues that you think should be further worked on to continue promoting gender responsive or gender transformative environmental initiatives that include women in all their diversity? Let me see. Well, I would say that first, access to education continues to be a very big challenge. Quality education in all different ways or forms, especially girls. They still have restrictions to access to education in science and mathematics. And then as they grow up in their active participation in technological innovation and, careers in science and technology at universities. In my university, for example, we still have, male women are normally joining careers of humanities and psychology and administration a little bit less, although the women are the majority in the university. But if we look at the engineering careers, we have great differences, and that it comes from childhood because girls are not encouraged to participate and to become astrophysicists or study mathematics or physics. And I think that also in ecological knowledge also has great differences or shows us great differences, not so much in biological and scientific knowledge, but the access to even ancestral knowledge. Women in local communities have a different perspective of the territory, different to the one of men, especially when there's very marked views of work. If men are hunters and women are the cooks of the prey, then there's already a differential in the knowledge, which could be very adaptive in the cultural context that it happens or occurs, but then they become impossible to generalize. So ecological knowledge at different areas or scales, it's still very much concentrated in very few people. And I think that it is very important that all women can have access to it. But aside from access to knowledge, access to technology as well is there. Women, not only because of their training, but also because of the roles they have to perform, many times are not considered as adequate or appropriate um, for strategic tasks or security. For example, our armies have taken too long to give, equal opportunities to women in those areas. And sometimes when they are given those opportunities, they will give them tasks, not of decision making, you know, positions. So there's also a glass ceiling there. And it has also to do with the access to management tools and access to, sectors that can empower them. So, of course, this aspect has always happened and this has been, talked about, but it continues to be a task we need to continue working on. And in a parallel way and a very related is the access to financial resources. So the funds, business venture funds, for example, are super important to be able to create an affirmative action for women and their proposals, because society still believes that female innovation or women innovation, they society still sees it with discriminatory lenses. They will say those are ideas of women. Women think they will become successful by doing things in that way, and they are criticizing them. And when they create or a new venture, that prejudice is so hard to overcome, and that's why banks have to create special funding or credit lines and conditions of assessing projects and I know services for accompanying for women, especially because otherwise they will never overcome that prejudice that the ideas of women are less important or less feasible than the ones coming from, businessmen. Brigitte, thank you very much. I am, making a change here in our script, and I'm going to extract one of the questions that we have received from our chat before continuing to what we have from our original script. And the question is, how can we potentiate and strengthen the different feminisms in order to help? For example, people that are part of the academic and political sector, how can we encourage and help those feminisms to achieve the common good? Thank you. Great question. I understand the question because we have already, different, you know, thought currents, feminism. Maybe the oldest one is the ecofeminism with a maternal character, care aspect. So it has an emphasis on the certain interpretation of what is feminine. And it is very different to the more urban feminisms or more combative feminisms that are based on the reproductive independence and the sexual autonomy and even to the negative of forming traditional families because of autonomy reasons. Those which are the most ancient ones now have many different areas and fields. Even the trans feminisms that are here today and should be understood. And it's like the recognition or the capacity that society has to contributing different sides in the interpretation of the historical richness of what is feminine, because what we are looking at is a recognition of the infinite conditions of what is feminine along thousands of years of history in many different cultures, because the reference points of femininity of the Quechua people are very different to the Zapoteca peoples, and also very different to the descendants of African slaves or the different colonists. So what we're looking at is a configuration of multiple nations of femininity that are now in the same pot being produced. And that I think, yes, they could generate, as always, narrative conflicts or conflicts of narrative or of access to certain rights, but that can only be solved as we increase dialogue and political debate, or respectful political debate, and that they can configure the multiple, women of the future. Fabulous. And these multiple women of the future lead me to the following question, and that, so what parallels can you see between biodiversity and gender diversity? So following the analogy I proposed at the beginning, could it be inferred that the greater the gender diversity, the greater the resilience of societies and communities, the greater the biological diversity, the greater the ecosystem health and resilience? What do you think about this? And another question, maybe you have made research on this. Is there a greater diversity? Is there evidence or documentation on generic based on sex on the more diverse countries? That's, a question we had. I would say yes to the first question. I believe that yes, that greater diversity in general is related to more innovation and more resilience, and also adaptive responses, both in the wildlife systems as they transformed in human nature one. There are still discussions going on in terms of if this relationship is as persistent or strong, or if it's manifested everywhere in the same way, because there's a myth on this. And excuse me, I'm going to bring in my charger because I'm about, my computer, it has a low battery. I forgot to connect my battery. But meanwhile, I think I can do it. If there's a short interruption, I will connect very quickly. No problem.
Sí, hay dudas sobre la
Yeah,
correlación
there's questions on the relationship between diversity and resilience, especially because a lot of diversity means a lot of intensity in relationships. It also means governance issues. In other words, you have to come into agreement between many different parties for things to work out. And in the urban area, this means political and communication systems. And in the systems where there's a multiplicity of species, this represents a constant, we could say, or we could call it a construction of ecological relationships that are evidence between synergy, symbiosis, and all these different ways of operating in order to maintain processes, live processes continuing. So I would say that in the last few years, there have been a lot of importance to gender diversity and sexual diversity, and also organization ways of care, what we would call family, in wildlife areas.
Sí. Aquí me colaboraron en casa. Respecto a la segunda.
So, with regard to the second question, it is a very good question. And I believe that the answer is yes, but we don't have the evidence or proof of that, because biological communities of our countries, which are very, very diverse, they have very intense dynamics or relationships in terms of ecological relationships as, depredation, and also in the construction of social relationships. So it would be worthwhile for us to ask ourselves on how much sexual diversity is working. Some wise words from Sabio Caldas, the wise person, which was one of the founders of science in the times of the independence here in Colombia, with regard to the condition. He would say the lustful condition. He would say that it's very much that this own exuberance of ecosystems of the Central American ecosystems and South American, especially the ones more equatorial and rainy, it's sometimes, frightening, because you can tell that sexuality in nature, it's boiling everywhere, and it even threatens civilization. But he was, a believer in the 19th century, and, nature, gave him, he made him nervous because of that exuberance and, productive capacity. And I think that in the end, it's what will allow us to overcome the problems of climate change. Thank you very much, Brigitte. So we keep getting questions. They're asking us, how can we potentiate the leaderships of women so that they can take decision-making positions in cooperatives and agricultural organizations? Many of them don't have knowledge on financial and economic studies. So, many of them can't take those positions. Well, you're giving me the answer to the question. So education, quality education with full access to the tools and technological tools and administrative tools, the most modern ones, because it's not about the fact that because they are women or because that sometimes they don't have, basic studies, enough basic studies to continue increasing the gap with bad quality or low quality education, or saying, well, you can't read well, so we can help you to access a position. And maybe we are basically going to condemn you to continue in that same position that you have now. You know, I think that's not the answer. I think it's about trying to find, ingenious and creative, solutions for everybody to be able to jump over the gap. And instead of having to go through the same steps as everybody to use their specific or special talent, or even their exclusion stories. And that's what we have seen with many women and many local female leaders, and where sometimes they don't even know how to read and write, and they have been able to get very far as they have different types of intelligence, and they are worth a lot if we are able to open up the opportunities for them to prove them and manifest them. And this question also had to do with the academia and universities. So what opportunities are there in the university level to propose more initiatives? What opportunities exist at the university level to propose more gender responsive initiatives that have a transformative impact on climate change? So I think that the first thing, the challenge that we have, or in my university and in all universities, is to open up opportunities and spaces and to be able to have dialogue building and a permanent construction of understanding what inclusion is, and true inclusion, and not just reductionist inclusion. In other words, how do we embrace differences fully? How do we embrace subjectivities between the feminine and the ethnic, or any other different backgrounds at the university level, for example, to address climate change, as you mentioned, to promote diverse action within universities, to promote with affirmative action, including the participation of women in all the programs of the universities, and in programs specifically oriented to addressing specific challenges where normally women cannot access, and understanding the reasons clearly of why women aren't able to reach these spaces. So we work with an educational program or model of challenges. And there are challenges that we can see that are apparently biased towards the capabilities of training for women. So we need to analyze why that happened and where our responsibility comes in providing those capabilities to everybody, to all people, to be able to form, teams that are equal with equality and parity. And sometimes we have to make decisions forcing parity, because otherwise we will not be able to break those spaces of exclusion that are maintained within the status quo, and not because of people's willingness, but simply because we don't see or we're not aware that there are invisible elements there that are limiting and restricting the participation of women in resolving those challenges, or academic or innovation, academic, topics that we are referencing. So this is a question that wasn't also planned, but it's probably something you know about. There are new reflections on the queer ecology factors and these partnerships. It's something that is coming into the political arena. It's something that is becoming more mature. What can you comment on this? Well, I believe that it is the recognition that diversity does not only come from the past, but that diversity is built. So diversity produces more diversity in order to continue maintaining the movement in the world. So an interpretation of diversity in culture is translated in these ideas of what is queer, and a more sophisticated interpretation of the sexualized behaviors of human beings that have reference in biological terms, but evidence does not stop there. In all the evidence of animals and plants have alternative behaviors in those terms, but we as human beings design our sexuality, we design our genders, we design our organizations of care. And it is an evolutionary pattern, an adaptive pattern, but it is not determined genetically, but it's part of the political or cultural innovation. And of course, it is subject to all the different normal discussions of cultural innovation. So we're talking about a transformation of the diversity policies. And that's where, depending on where you're at, how much do people feel, comfortable when facing these innovations? And of this, of course, I am part of that search and that moving of building diversity. Thank you so much. This has truly been a revealing dialogue, a diverse dialogue, and a dialogue that gives us a lot of guidelines on what could be the road towards not only recognizing diversity, but also generating public policies and cooperation that can lead us to the fact that biodiversity and human biodiversity to be expressed in a more inclusive way. And in that sense, for us to have not only ecosystem health, but also resilience at the level of society. So this conversation truly has illuminated us. And I think that the possibility of that illumination comes in precisely from the grandiosity of human diversity. And for that, we would like to thank you very much, Brigitte, for the importance that has been highlighted from you for the key role that women play in the international agendas and actions towards the combat to climate crisis, to the climate crisis, and the understanding of the parallels that there could be between nature, diversity. And I think that this has been a very fruitful dialogue that, opens up a lot of, I think that a lot of chakras become activated through these dialogues, because I think that these are dialogues that are not only going to our brains, but they're also going to other sides and areas where we can make our understanding or comprehension flow more, which is the base to creating these spaces of understanding of ourselves also. So we would truly like to thank you for all this conversation, Brigitte. Is there anything else that would you like to give us some last few reflections? Thank you very much, Jose. Very kind words. And so I would just like to invite to this permanent reflection on the construction of identities and the rescue that is, put in evidence of exclusions, and especially, of course, those that are associated to the gender, sex, or we normally come from the discrimination from women. So it continues to be a very marked element in our societies, and women, understanding women as a huge dimension, the people that because of anatomical and reproductive reasons or cultural reasons have been left behind from the benefits of the contemporary society. Thank you so much, Brigitte, and to all of you that have joined us today. Before finishing, I would like to remind you that our next Green and Violet Coffee Time, we will be able to hear again the voices of Latin American women who protect and transform our environment. And it will be held on September 3rd with the participation of Hortensia Hidalgo from the Indigenous Women's Network for Biodiversity. I hope you enjoyed this dialogue as much as I did. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Brigitte. Thank you very much, Jose and UNDP.